The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War and in Vietnam as the Resistance War against America, or simply the American War, was a conflict in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from 1st November 1955 to the fall of Saigon on 30 April 1975. It was the second of the Indochina Wars and was officially fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies. South Vietnam was supported by the United States, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Thailand, and other anti-communist allies. The war, considered a Cold War-era proxy war by some, lasted 19 years, with direct U.S. involvement ending in 1973, and included the Laotian Civil War and the Cambodian Civil War, resulting in all three countries becoming communist in 1975. The conflict emerged from the First Indochina War against the communist-led Viet Minh. Most of the funding for the French war effort was provided by the U.S., and after the French quit Indochina in 1954, the U.S. assumed financial and military support for the South Vietnamese state. U.S. involvement escalated in 1960 under President John F. Kennedy through the MAAG program from just under 1,000 in 1959 to 16,000 in 1963. Also by 1963, the North Vietnamese had sent 40,000 soldiers to fight in South Vietnam, and supplies were supported by the People's Republic of China in both arms and logistics personnel. By 1964, there were 23,000 U.S. advisors in South Vietnam during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which a U.S. destroyer was alleged to have clashed with North Vietnamese fast attack craft. In response, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authorization to increase U.S. military presence, deploying ground combat units for the first time and increasing troop levels to 184,000. Past this point, the People's Army of Vietnam, known also as the NVA, engaged in more conventional warfare with U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Every year onward, there was significant buildup of U.S. forces despite little progress, with Robert McNamara, one of the principal architects of the war, expressing doubts of victory by the end of 1966. U.S. and SVN forces relied on air superiority and overwhelming firepower to conduct search and destroy operations involving ground forces, artillery, and airstrikes. The United States also conducted large-scale strategic bombing campaigns against North Vietnam and Laos. The Tet Offensive of 1968 showed the lack of progress with these doctrines as the NLF mounted large-scale urban offensives throughout 1968, turning U.S. domestic support against the war. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, expanded following a period of neglect after Tet. The Viet Cong sustained heavy losses and reduced influence, but declared itself a provisional revolutionary government, being sidelined as PAVN forces began more conventional combined arms warfare. Operations that crossed into Laos and Cambodia were used by North Vietnam as supply routes and were heavily bombed by the United States. After 1968, President Richard Nixon's policy of Vietnamization saw the conflict fought by an expanded ARVN with U.S. forces sidelined and increasingly demoralized by domestic opposition and reduced recruitment. U.S. ground forces withdrew by late 1971, and U.S. involvement became limited to air and artillery support plus military advice. The ARVN, along with U.S. air support, stopped the largest and first mechanized PAVN offensive to date during the Easter Offensive of 1972, resulting in mutually heavy casualties, but failed to recapture all territory, leaving its military situation difficult. The Paris Peace Accord saw all U.S. forces withdrawn and intervention prohibited by the U.S. Congress on 15 August 1973 as a result of the Case Church Amendment. The peace accords were broken almost immediately, and fighting continued for 2 years following the U.S. withdrawal, with 1972 to 1974 seeing heavy fighting and constituting the war's bloodiest years for the ARVN. The 1975 spring offensive culminated in the capture of Saigon by the NVA in April 1975. This marked the end of the war, and North and South Vietnam were reunified the following year. The war exacted a huge cost in terms of fatalities. Estimates of the number of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed vary from 966,000 to 3.8 million, some 275,000 to 310,000 Cambodians, 20,000 to 62,000 Laotians, and 58,220 U.S. service members also died in the conflict, and a further 1,626 remain missing in action. Out of the 58,220 servicemen killed, 592 were from the state of Arkansas. Today, Americans honor their Vietnam veterans the way they should, with respect and dignity. On 25 May 2012, President Barack Obama issued a proclamation of the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. On 10 November 2017, President Donald Trump issued an additional proclamation commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. The Wings of Honor Museum would like to thank each of the Vietnam veterans visiting our museum for their service and sacrifice for the cause of freedom.